Well, good morning, everyone. It's always so lovely to worship at Springwood. And that song, I am a child of God, I'm no longer needing to fear. That's the theme of my sermon today. Icicles or popsicles. And if you saw the sign out the front and thought you were getting free popsicles, sorry, didn't quite have enough. But anyway, just have a quick prayer before we start. Dear Father, as we listen to the sermon this morning, please may you open our ears. Please speak your words through me today, and may your message touch lives. Amen. Well, icicles have always fascinated me, and I guess growing up in Christchurch, New Zealand, I certainly saw enough of them. Those below zero mornings where, this is one of my sister's pot plants in New Zealand actually, where the ice would drip from the pot plants and spoutings and windows and off the roof lines. But it was actually up at Lake Linden where I saw some of the very best icicles. Now, Lake Linden is a very beautiful lake nestled in between the mountains of Arthur's Pass, just an hour west of Christchurch. And the Pathfinders owned a lodge up here, and you can see it just about the middle of the screen there. And the dads and the youth ministers of the day, they built this Pathfinder Lodge, and us kids, well, we just enjoyed it thoroughly. And in the wintertime, it was not uncommon for the lake to freeze completely over, and we would spend hours skating on that lake. I believe that we in Christchurch, New Zealand, had some of the best Pathfinder camps ever. Now, the lodge was an A-frame structure. It was basic, but it was dry and it was warm and it was comfortable. And on cold, frosty nights, any water or condensation would actually drip down and freeze along the edges of this A-frame lodge, forming this beautiful display of icicles along each side of the lodge. And around the back of the lodge were the bathrooms. And that's where the spouting often overflowed. And that's where we had often huge, long, large icicles. Now, here's a picture of myself and my two older sisters with some very large icicles. In fact, these icicles are longer than our pants, our trousers that we're wearing. I mean, how could this fashion ever be allowed? And I was lucky enough to be the youngest one in this little group. We have a younger sister again. And so I was able to wear these pants every year, after year, after year, after year. And if I was careful enough, they actually got another year out of them as well. But we're not talking about pants today, we're talking about Lake Linden. So wintertime at Lake Linden was really spectacular. It was just wonderful. Snow on the ground outside, icicles along the roof edges, and the girls, especially the friends and the companions, we would make believe that this lodge had turned somehow into a castle, and we'd make up all sorts of stories and games about magical worlds of ice and snow. But the boys, they'd wreck it, as boys are often prone to do. So instead of enjoying the icicles in this fantasy world, they would break the icicles off the side, and they would then start pretending that they were wielding them with swords. They were swords, and jabbing and prodding and threatening and poking each other. And then there was always a competition. And I don't know why boys do this sort of thing, but there was always a competition. The competition was to see who could get an icicle down the boys' pants first. Really? Boys, why do you do this sort of stuff? I really don't know. Us girls would just stand there and shake our heads. But then one camp, some of the older boys thought it would be a really good idea if they could interrogate the younger boys about whether they knew the memory verse or whether they knew their denominational history or the pledge and the law, because we were actually having a denominational history test the next day. And so they would wield their swords, they would chase the younger boys around and they would catch them, then they'd hold them down, then they'd say, "Tell me Proverbs 37:9. What's the pledge? Tell me, what was the year of the great disappointment?" And if the little victim didn't know the answer, then the ropes that were supposed to be used for the knot tying honour, well, they were used to tie up the victim. Then they were dragged off into a makeshift but rather secure thorn bush jail. And they were told that when they knew it, they could stand up and say, "I know it," and they'd be freed. Well, one particular Pathfinder camp, one of the boys, David, was captured, he was prodded, he was poked, he was asked if he knew a particular verse. He didn't know the answers, so he too was placed and dragged into this jail. Now, David came from a pretty rough home, and he struggled socially and he struggled academically. So no amount of time in jail was actually going to enable him to learn, but he was put there anyway. He didn't call out that he knew the answers, and so he was left. And then David was forgotten. Someone forgot to release him, and when the whistle sounded for dinner that night, everybody rushed inside but David. And it was actually quite some time later, hours later, at worship time that night, that it was noticed that David was missing. And when the leaders went out to find him, he was huddled in a small ball, trying to keep warm. And when he was asked, well, why didn't you yell out and scream and get someone to come and get you? And he responded through the chattering teeth, I was too scared. Because fear does that to us. It paralyses our thinking. So when our anxious brain is working, our thinking brain is not. However, I'm sure some of you sitting here are going to go, well, you know what? What's wrong with this kid? Surely he could have done something to help himself. Well, I wish that were true of all children. Sadly and unfortunately, children that grow up in homes of fear, fighting, distress, abuse, they have a predisposition for continued anxiety issues through their teenage years and then through their adult life. Trauma changes the brain. The individual has less resilience. They don't have confidence to ask for help. They don't socialise very well, and they have a very low self-esteem. And then when things are threatening and frightening, they either withdraw and try and avoid facing the stressful situation, or they can become very hyper-aroused. So they can become highly anxious, maybe demanding, maybe angry, and then they feel victimised if something is said about their behaviour. Now, David, I found out years later, came from a very distressing family situation. So rolling into a ball to keep himself warm and try and survive on that cold night, he was actually just engaging a protection behaviour, because we adopt and we repeat behaviours that make us feel safe. Now, others, of course, may react differently. The fight or the flight survival mechanism causes us often to thrash about and scream and yell, trying to be held against our will. But if no one comes still, we either do something really drastic to get out of the situation we're in, and there have been stories, plenty of them, of people actually cutting off limbs to actually free themselves from between rocks or difficult places that's been too fearful. So if no one came, even the yelling and screaming would subside, and they too would eventually just withdraw and shut down. It's very interesting to study the research of the people that have been trapped in fearful situations for long periods. For example, kidnapped or hostage victims. At first, the victim may react. They may cry out, they may plead, they'll attempt to escape, they'll try desperately to stop the discomfort and fear they are experiencing. But as the hours and the days and the months and the years tick by, resistance eventually subsides, and most kidnapped or hostage victims become resolute that these conditions are now their future and there is no way out. We see it also in situations of domestic violence, where there's often a belief that there is no escape. So given a long enough period of time, if these victims are taken out and there are actually avenues of escape, it is common for them not to actually understand what their options are anymore. And psychologist Martin Seligman coined this as learned helplessness, the perception of inescapability and its associated cognitive shutdown, which means the victim just sees their situation as hopeless. and resigns themselves to living like this, fear takes over and traps them. Fear is devastating and it's debilitating. We don't necessarily like where we are or what we do or how we respond to certain stimuli, but we either don't know how to get out of the situation or change is too hard. So we become trapped. And as Christians, we are actually not immune to fear. Fear and perplexity is also alive and strongly influences many Christians. Facing death, chronic illness, cancers, or we may fear our loved ones might miss out on heaven. We may fear the time of the end. And, we've read the prophecies, we've seen the signs, and we can become so obsessed with worry about the things that are happening in this world. They say that nurses make the worst patients when it comes to childbirth. They know the most, and so they fear the most. And I can't help wondering if this could apply to some SDA Christians as well. Because the great controversy and the things that we read paint very, very vivid pictures about how things will be in the last days. And we can scare ourselves into a sense of hopelessness because we worry that we won't be strong enough, courageous enough, brave enough to be able to face these trials at the end of time. But then the greatest fear of all can be wondering if we're actually good enough. Are there any secret sins I haven't confessed? Am I acceptable enough? And so we respond in a number of ways. Our spiritual fear stimulates certain behavioural reactions. We block it out. We love God, but some of this Bible stuff, it just makes me freak out. It's just too scary. And so we refuse to read or talk about or hear about any part of the Bible that can arouse fear in us. And we can even get annoyed and maybe angry with those that like to talk about this sort of thing. So we shut down. We turn off, we change the subject, or we simply just walk away. This is a normal avoidance response when we feel fear because we have a psychological need to avoid distress. We also become fearful if we don't have a sense of control. Now, if these guys here turned up at your window on the way home from church today at the stoplights, you would have a major fear reaction because they are now in control of your life, not you. And we would frantically search for options, a way out. The more options we have, the safer we feel. And we do the same in our spiritual lives. Having options, being in control makes us feel safe. So we memorise Bible scriptures and study the Bible more and pray more and pour ourselves into history to know the wheres and the whys and the hows and the whos of when the Sabbath was changed, different doctrines that we have because we just have to know so we'll be prepared because being prepared gives us a sense of control. Our fears can also make us really zealous in taking every opportunity to make sure that our unsaved family members know what they should be doing and how they should be living. But these are also normal behavioural responses when we feel fearful. Doing more is the third behavioural response, a little like Martha when Jesus was dining at her table, rushing around, being busy, not because she had to, but because it gave her value. And maybe, just maybe, she would be more acceptable to Jesus. An underlying fear of not feeling good enough often motivates busyness. We may also attempt to please God more by keeping the law better, praying more, giving more. And we have a need for self-esteem enhancement. We strive for personal value because then we have purpose and then we feel more accepted. However, there is one more basic psychological need, and it's the most essential need in regards to mental wellness. There is an innate need in every human being for safe attachments, safe connections with others. And if we don't have safe connections, we can experience chronic anxiety. And this also applies to our spiritual lives. We need connections with others. So getting together at church is a very, very good thing. But most important for our spiritual well-being, we need a real and genuine and secure and sincere connection with Jesus Christ. Because being connected with Jesus is actually the only way to cast out fear. Knowing Bible facts won't do it. Doing more for others won't cast out fear. Shutting down and avoiding won't do it. Paying more tithe and giving offerings, lovely, but it's not going to take away fear. Only a secure attachment with Jesus is going to take away fear. And that's why that song we've just sung, being a child of God, makes us no longer slaves to fear. Because Jesus told us there will be persecutions and there will be problems. It's part of living in this world. On the earth, nations will be in anguish and perplexity. Men will faint from terror, apprehensive of what is coming on the world. But Jesus tells us to be careful. Be careful, he says in Luke, that your hearts are not weighed down with the anxieties of life. How we perceive the world, our perceptions of God, and what we focus our attention on reflects how we relate to God and then to others. Teenagers were given a palette of colours of paints, and they were told to paint their perceptions of God in colour. Well, those that feared the wrath of God, doing things wrong, being punished, they commonly, very commonly, painted in shades of black and white and dark brown. And these same individuals stated that they always try and win God's favour, always try and be good enough to please him. Now, others saw God as a judge. We live in a sin-sick world. He's coming soon. So red and orange is what predominantly used. And they depicted fear and fire. Other paintings depicted end-time events, various prophecies. And these paintings were actually rather depressing because they were predominantly in colours of ash and grey. But there are paintings that used the entire palette of colours. These were the individuals that used the words saved, redeemed, grace. Because the gospel of grace is so vibrant, no one colour fits. So all the colours need to be used. Because grace is a message so vitally, undeniably important to understand, to believe, and to adopt. Because only grace offers a spiritual peace. And from a neuroscience perspective, only grace. Grace is the only message that actually casts out fear rather than heightens it. Can you think of a religion that doesn't have the grace factor? And it's a religion that's surrounded by superstitions and uncertainties and fears and punishments. One of the most beautiful and moving stories of grace is played out in the musical Les Miserables. It's the story of Jean Valjean, the story of a simple grace that changed a life. Grace that cast out fear, that gave a man value and worth. The story of a man stepping out of a life of fear and into a life filled with hope. And I'm sure you know the story. It's of the convict Jean Valjean who was imprisoned for 20 years because he stole a loaf of bread. But when he is paroled, he takes shelter at the vicarage and he's shown hospitality by the bishop. However, Valjean was very tempted and he found the temptation too great and he stole the bishop's silverware. He takes it and he vanishes into the night. But he doesn't get far. It's a bit dark, isn't it? But he's kneeling down the bottom there. And he's stopped by the police guards. Then he tries to lie his way out of trouble. But he's immediately taken back to the bishop's home with the full bag of silver. Well, Valjean waits for the condemnation that he knows he deserves. And he stands before the bishop in fear. But instead, he's offered grace. And grace more abundantly. Not only the silver cutlery, the bishop said, you forgot the most valuable part. You need to take the candlesticks as well. One moment, Jean Valjean faces a lifetime of fear in prison again, the next freedom and abundance. So Valjean recognises the amazing gift that's been offered to him, and because of grace, he chooses to make something out of his life and becomes an act of love to others. But opposed to Jean Valjean is Javert, the constable, a man committed to the law, obeys the law, and instills fear in those who don't follow the law. And in Javert's world, there is no room for grace. He's blind to his own lead, wrapped up in his own fears. He's scared he doesn't do enough, so he instills this fear in others. And as a result of that, his capacity to love others actually withers and dies. He is only able to find fault with others and jab icicles of condemnation, icicles of obedience, and icicles of criticism. Javert is out to get Valjean, and he pursues him relentlessly. Now, Valjean actually had an opportunity to kill Javert, and who would have blamed him? As he would have been rid of his persecutor. However, Jean Valjean understood grace because he had experienced grace. The acceptance of grace casts out fear and gives us the ability to forgive even our enemies. Jean Valjean actually risks his life to save Javert, but Javert just can't bring himself to accept grace. He would rather end his life than accept the truth that his own fears he's also unworthy. So Javert just jumps off the bridge and ends his life. Now, there are so many parallels in the story of Les Mis to the saving grace of Jesus, but the sad part is, like Javert, many can't bring themselves to accept this gift of grace, a gift that would actually free us from all our fears. And Luke 13:34 says, "O Jerusalem," Jesus is lamenting over Jerusalem. He desperately wants his people to come to him, to know of the Father's love, to protect the nation, to take away fears and take away their impending doom. So he says, "Jerusalem, O Jerusalem, how often have I longed to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings." Jesus pleads, come to me and be safe. You don't have to live in fear. Please let me shelter you. Let me protect you. Let me fold my wings of grace and mercy and love and care over you. And I hope you've noticed all the little chicken feet underneath those beautiful wings, totally protecting the young. Well, one afternoon, Ray and I were driving down Mount Lindsay Highway when we lived out at Logan Village, and a mother duck and her babies came waddling across the road. Now, we slowed down to let them pass safely. They got to the middle of the road and then all hell broke loose. because the car coming towards us on the other side of the road didn't slow, didn't brake at all. He just ploughed straight into this mother duck and this little family, killed the mother duck instantly, leaving the little tiny orphaned ducklings. I was just devastated and I yelled in terror as I saw this unfold in front of my eyes. Ray, bless his beautiful heart, he stopped, got out of the car and was able to rescue 3 of these precious little ducklings. But those poor little things, they were motherless, they were orphaned. So we kept and we raised these 3 ducklings until they were old enough to fly away. And during that time of playing mother duck, I often thought of how Jesus longs to gather his children together, to protect and to strengthen and to save us from the fears that plough into our lives. But then at the end of Luke 13:34, it says this horrible, gut-wrenching line, "But you were not willing." How could that be? That extraordinarily painful feeling of love being rejected. Jesus says, I wanted so desperately to be with you, to save you, but you were not willing. Well, I wanted my little ducklings to be safe, to be protected, but I didn't plead with my ducklings to stay. I simply just caged them. I put them in the empty hen house and I forced them to stay with me. But caging is not Jesus' way. He holds that gate wide open every day. He gives us choice daily, moment by moment. He doesn't prod us and poke us and force us to do things. He's not jabbing at us with icicles of fear. He doesn't hold us captive until we are good enough, know enough, or have done enough, as the pathfinders did to that poor boy David. Instead, he offers hope. He offers security. He offers peace to soothe our greatest fears. Now, I'm not a grandma. One day I hope I might be. But I know grandmas also have a very special way to soothe fears. Popsicles. Ray's mum had boxes of popsicles in her freezer just for the grandkids. I don't believe I got too many. And she would care for our son Cameron when Ray and I went to work each day. This is back in Mildura's times. And then I would collect Cameron at the end of the day. And I would know how the day had gone by the number of Icicles or popsicles that were given out. So I was met at the door and said, well, Karen, it was a 3 popsicle day today, which meant there were at least 3 upsets or skin knees or falls from trees or whatever. Now, 4-year-old Cameron would be standing holding Grandma's hand and just milking this for all it was worth. And he would look up at Cameron with his beautiful, big, brown eyes and say, but Grandma, I could have another one. And do you know what she'd say? Well, just a minute then. And off she'd trot to the freezer and bring out another popsicle and say, just for the road. Grandma couldn't help herself. Money was never plentiful in her family, but she loved in abundance, and she always gave so generously. Jesus, our Saviour, can't help himself. He gave until there was no more life to give, and he keeps on giving. And like Grandma, he doesn't stop at one popsicle or 2 or 3. He gives an abundance. Cups and freezers runneth over. In fact, he gives us more than our heart's desire. I'm so blessed. We often hear people say of their new house, their latest cruise, their generous wage, their happy life, their latest employment. But Jesus gives. So we will share. He sees too many Davids in this world. He asks us to feed the hungry, clothe the naked, and share our blessings. But if we only give popsicles that people that are our friends, or for people that can actually return and give us popsicles back, what good is that? The Bible says it in Matthew. If you only greet your brothers, you're not doing anything else than anybody. It's not anything great. So he says, be with the widows, the orphans, the downhearted, and even share with your enemies. It's the Davids of this world that actually need the popsicles the most. They need acceptance, they need love, attachments and inclusion the most. Because it's the Davids in society that probably have missed out. The Davids we see maybe a little bit socially inept. Maybe they have an addiction problem. Maybe there's a teenage pregnancy. Maybe there's depression. Maybe they're just a little bit rough around the edges. Or maybe they say and do really inappropriate things. And we can look at them and say, well, you know what? I don't really have to share with them because, well, they've really brought the problems on themselves. I mean, they've had a pretty rough childhood, but really everyone makes choices. But what we fail to see is that for the Davids of this world, childhood experiences set trajectories that greatly influence the choices we are able to make, even as children. And we all have ways to cope with pain, physical pain, emotional pain. It's just that some addictions or behaviours, they are probably less obvious, more socially acceptable. Maybe we can just keep them more hidden from others. But there are those people that struggle. They struggle with society because society has been unsafe. There is something broken in the heart of someone who gravitates towards their sinful desires. So instead of poking icicles of condemnation, we need to ask, what broke in their heart to make them do the things they do? What hurt goes so deep that they have taken up and they continue with these behaviours? These are the people who struggle with society. The uncle they trusted sexually abused them. The father they needed neglected them. The mother they longed for affirmation, support and encouragement. She was so busy dealing with her own pain, she didn't attend to them. The teachers that they wanted to learn from, well, they just were labelled as behaviour problems and had a poor attitude to learning. The priests and the ministers who preached about love and God's laws, they used their position to violate them. Or maybe they've just experienced a loss so great, a death, a trauma that they've never actually fully recovered from. There are too many Davids in our world. Davids that are left out in the cold, forgotten and ignored. But they will very rarely call out and come in here to us. Despite our welcoming signs at the gate, despite our happy smiles and our handshakes, our open doors, despite our mission programs, inviting community to come in, they will very rarely walk in. Why? Because once upon a time, society has been unsafe. Past experience has taught them that smiles can't always be trusted. They lure. Extended hands can hold, but hands can also hurt badly. Sometimes reaching people for the kingdom means we need to go out to them. We need to know the gospel of grace. They need to know that the gospel of grace can change lives and heal brokenness. But instead of us expecting them to come to us, we need to go and be the grace. Helping other people can be a cure, not just for those who are in need, but our own souls as well. Giving what we were wearing. Being the grace means to take our fears and our judgmental icicles and lay them under the sun. Because as the sun shines on us, it melts us. And as we melt, we soften and we have more compassion And as those icicles soften, our compassion then drips down onto others and we become rivers of love and oceans of grace, reaching others who so desperately need popsicles too. I pray that we will let God's love shine on us so we can then shine with compassion and understanding and empathy onto those we meet in our daily lives.